Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll provide a short intro in about 1 minute as we allow everyone else to enter the webinar. Right? I see people filing in. Thank you all so much for joining us on a Friday afternoon. We will have an exciting conversation for you, really interesting overview, and I'm looking forward to sharing all of that with y'all in a few minutes. All right. Okay, I think we can go ahead and at least start the introduction. We are also recording this for anyone that may miss part of the webinar or know another partner or stakeholder that was interested but could not attend. This webinar will be recorded. So I would like to welcome you all to Assessing Opportunities and Barriers for Minority Producers Transitioning to Climate Smart and Regenerative Agriculture Programs. Thank y'all so much for folks that are here on a Friday afternoon. We are promising a rigorous discussion and a really amazing overview. Next slide. So I am Dr. Lakeisha Odom from the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, where I sit as a scientific program director on the agroecosystems priority area. I will also introduce my colleague Suzanne Russo from Resources for the Future and Seneca Edwards Heron from Freedman Ayers Foundation. And we will, during this talk, give a little bit about our organizations and why we banded together and wanted to partner to bring this webinar and this topic forward. And then Seneca will provide an amazing analysis of the state of minority producers, where she will talk about economic opportunities and impacts and the way in which climate smart regenerative ag investments could address some of these challenges. And then we will have time for Q&A with the attendees. Next slide. A little bit of housekeeping. You'll note that you will not be able to access unmute yourself, but we strongly encourage, please put any chats, any questions in the chat or Q&A. We'll continue to monitor throughout the talk. And then at the end, we will have ample time to ask questions of our speaker. And so please, any questions you might have, please continue to put them in the chat, and we'll continue to remind you to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will record and share this webinar with registrants, and the webinar recording will also be available on our website for your reference. So there are lots of opportunities to access this information. And if I remember correctly, a subset of the slides will also be available to be shared after the webinar has ended. Next slide, please. So part of the reason why we wanted to just think about why would FAR, Resources for the Future, and Freedman Ayers, what were we hoping to accomplish? Why this topic? Why this webinar series? And you'll hear more from Seneca, but we all recognize that minority producers are a critical component for our nation's security. They also are amazing stewards and land managers, and many minority producers are most exclusively food producers, and they grow crops and produce livestock that feed regional communities as well as growing commodity crops. But minority producers are often small producers that tend to have more limited resources than their white counterparts, yet they use a huge amount of ingenuity and they deeply understand their land, but they are severely underinvested in across the spectrum. So this panel, we hope, will talk a little bit about, as we are encouraging more and more of our growers to transition due to climate or think about regenerative practices, how do we create alternative pathways for those minority producers to get information and access resources as a result of the exclusion of past and current programs? We also want to explore the role of economists and researchers and how they can develop more sustainable agricultural solutions as we combat climate change and challenges that result from producers in these spaces as a result of climate change. And we also want to think about different opportunities and pathways available to producers of color. So not just this webinar, but our webinar series as a whole, there'll be 4 webinars. We'll have more information on the additional dates at the end of the presentation. But this whole webinar series is really us trying to understand what are the opportunities for minority producers? What are the barriers? And then what are some things that we can think about creatively as a community of researchers, economists, socioeconomic researchers, folks that are producers themselves, folks that are engaging with farmers and producers, like how do we get the whole network of folks that are in these spaces? How do we think creatively about how we can address some of the upcoming challenges? So the goal of this is to spur a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, and a lot of interaction. So that's why we heavily encourage y'all to feel comfortable putting questions in the chat, because that's the purpose of this webinar, is to share information, yes, but also hear back from the attendees. Next slide, please. So for those that are less familiar with FAR, I'll give a brief introduction. So basically FAR, Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, pronounced FAR, we're an independent 501c3. We were created in the 2014 Farm Bill. FAR builds unique public-private partnerships. We connect funders, researchers, and farmers with a goal of providing every person access to affordable, nutritious food grown on thriving farms. To date, we have funded over 306 grants and awarded approximately $750 million, either awarded and matched with over 550 distinct partners. We work across 4 priority areas: cultivating thriving production systems, which includes work around crop production systems and animal production systems; bolstering healthy food systems, which looks at not just urban food systems, but also health and ag and nutrition, and that nexus there; sustaining vibrant agro ecosystems, which is the priority area in which I sit, where we look at soil health, sustainable water management, and climate; and then finally, strengthening the scientific workforce, where we look at training the next innovative leaders in workforce. The way in which FAR works is that we use public-private partnerships to increase research funding across these priority areas. For every dollar that FAR spends, we have to find a non-federal matching partner. But one other thing that FAR loves to do is convene to have conversations around potential gaps in research and research needs. And so we hope that this webinar series will also help us to identify opportunities for additional research questions that can be answered and potentially research that can be funded. Now I'd like to transition to my colleague, Suzanne Rousseau, to talk a little bit more about resources for the future, a little bit more about their mission and vision. Thank you for sharing some time with us today.
Thank you, Lakeisha, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're incredibly excited to be kicking off this webinar series. And to provide a little bit of background on Resources for the Future and our involvement in this work, we are a nonprofit environmental research organization. We primarily undertake economic and social sciences research to help inform the development of climate policy, regulations, and rulemaking. And as we at RFF work on understanding the climate transition within the agricultural sector, trying to inform policies for decarbonization and also economic resiliency around agriculture in the United States, we want to make sure that we understand these unique opportunities and barriers for minority producers to access different programs and resources, and also to lead our transition in climate change within agriculture for farming and ranching. So we're incredibly excited to be partnering with Friedman Yares Foundation and FAR on this project. And it's my absolute pleasure to turn this discussion over to Seneca Edwards, the founder and executive director of Friedman Yares Foundation, who's going to be leading us today in this session. Thank you, Seneca.
Thank you, Suzanne, and good afternoon, everyone. Give me a few seconds to share my screen. I am also very excited to be here and to talk about this subject. I think that it is one that is very imperative for where we are in agriculture right now. And I also feel that this is a topic that we're likely to see continue to build momentum as we transition and we learn more about regenerative agricultural practices, climate smart practices, as well as how to effectively battle climate change while still continuing to produce food that feeds our communities as well as the world. So again, my name is Seneca Edwards Heron. I am the founder and executive director of Freedmen Heirs Foundation. Freedmen Heirs, we are a nonprofit organization with a laser focus on expediting change in U.S. agriculture by bridging the gap between two worlds, Black farmers and the marketplace. We are dedicated to eliminating inequities in agriculture, and we do this through providing our producers or the producers that we serve access to technical assistance, capital, and new market opportunities. We at Freedmen Heirs, we approach the work that we do and the people that we serve with the acronym of TRUST, meaning we operate with a level of transparency. We're open and honest with the producers that we serve as well as other stakeholders. Respect. We respect producers' right to choose, but we also respect the historical standpoints and some of the difficulties that Black farmers have faced in the United States. Also understanding, we support them through technical assistance, but also if we need to be there to explain USDA programs, other programs, any way that we can meet the farmers where they are, it is our job and our duty to do that. And then transformation, that goes back to eliminating the inequities. We like to forge transformational partnerships as opposed to transactional. We want to make sure that equity is integrated into everything that we do. And I believe that equity is the basis for all transformational partnerships and collaborations that will lead to transformational outcomes for Black farmers. So a quick overview of the presentation structure. First, I would like to start off with historical and current state of minority producers. Next, I will explore economic opportunities through climate smart agriculture and regenerative agricultural practices, strategies for investment and support. And then we get to the fun part, which is the participant engagement and questions. As Dr. Odom mentioned earlier, please place your questions in the chat, any comments that you may have, that you just want to have ideas that you want to get out to us. We are very open and appreciative of your thoughts and your comments. So please just stick them in the chat, and then towards the end of the presentation period, we will have time for Q&A. So the objectives of this potential virtual convening is number one, to bring awareness and education. Number two, understanding what the current landscape is. Highlighting those economic opportunities is the third objective, facilitating access to investments, and then to continue to encourage engagement and discussion. So historical context. When we think about American agriculture, we cannot just fall into the ideal nostalgic agriculture that we sometimes like to think about. U.S. agriculture does have a very negative history, a lot of difficulties, marred by discrimination, systemic racism, and just flat out refusal or denial of access to market opportunities, as well as access to just information or even governmental programs. So when we think about the early foundations, minority farmers have always been an integral part of American agriculture. That goes back to indigenous and Native American farmers, as well as including enslaved Africans who were brought to this country because of the agricultural knowledge and techniques that they were utilizing. And then we think about post-emancipation and the challenges that were faced there by Black farmers who, post-emancipation around 1920, were at their peak. They were able to acquire land. They were beginning to farm independently, but systemic discrimination, as well as racism and other, how do I say it? Other systemic hurdles were thrown at them that continue to have an undercurrent and what we're starting to see today. And so when we think about some of the challenges that you're going to hear me talk about from a historical context, that does not mean that those have dissipated. They've evolved and changed the way that they are currently operating. So when we think about Native American agriculture, Native American tribes also have a long history of utilizing sustainable farming practices, but they faced land dispossession and they were forced to assimilate, which reduced their agricultural contributions overall. We fast forward to the 20th century. Again, we see a large influx and major contributions from Hispanic and Asian immigrant farmers, especially in places like on the West Coast, specifically California, the Southeast. But they, again, were often met with challenging and inequitable positions. So we have enslaved Africans, Black Americans, Indigenous, Native Americans, Hispanic, Asian immigrant farmers who are all continuously experiencing these challenges, but they remain resilient and producing in this country and helping to feed the country as well as production for global trade. And so when we're walking through how we are looking at regenerative and climate smart commodities, I would like for everyone to just keep a lens on equity, because up until, historically, equity has not been woven into American agriculture and how American agriculture has supported minority farmers. So during the civil rights movement, that was also a very important and crucial time for minority producers because it highlighted discrimination within agricultural policies and funding. And so I'm sure, but maybe not everyone that's on the call today has heard of the Pigford versus Glickman lawsuit in 1999, where Black farmers won a major discrimination suit against USDA. And even with the winning of Pigford versus Glickman, African American farmers are still very much under duress, and they're still very much experiencing discrimination and not having the access to support and different programs and market access that they need to be economically viable with their production. And we'll look at the numbers shortly. And then modern developments. Today, minority farmers they should be leaders in sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices. However, they continue to face challenges in land ownership, access to loans, and equal treatment in agricultural policy. The work that we're doing with this series of virtual convenings as well as in-person convening later in, early 2025 is to draw out what some of those barriers are and then prescribe strategic investments on how to help these producers overcome those barriers. So here is a chart, and I do apologize. This data is from the NAS Census of Agriculture. And before we send this PowerPoint presentation out to everyone, I'll make sure I put the source at the bottom. But I thought it was very important to go as far back as we could with the data. 1900, 1920, and just take snapshots in time, and so that we can see what this looks like. This is in tabular form because I wanted to make sure that everyone could see the percentage change from 1920 to 1922. In 1920, Black farmers were at their peak. They were almost 1 million strong. But as you can see, when you look at the percentage change, most of the other minority farm groups have increased, whereas Black farmers have decreased significantly, approximately 95% since 1920. You go from close or just shy of 1 million to right now around 42,000. Then when we look at land and acres, because land is very important, it is the backbone to agricultural production. You're not producing anything if you don't have farmland. So when we're looking at acreage, we can also see that Black farmers in 1920 were right around 41 million acres. Now, according to NAS Census of Agriculture data, they're right around 5 million. That's an 87% reduction since the top of the century. When I look at the data, it makes me question what's happening here. Other minority groups are seeing some increases in number. Now, when you look at it relative to white farmers, it's still very small. However, they're seeing some increases. But when we think and look at Black farmers, we're not seeing that same direction in trend lines. We're continuing to see reduction. And this is looking at it from, over 100 years. I do realize that from 2017 to 2022, there was a slight uptick in acreage. So looking at it differently in a chart, it shows, wow, Black farmers, huge drop by 1978. And as you can see, 1997 was the lowest and marginal increases. But to go from almost 1 million to 41,000, that indicates that there's something that's taking place that is prohibiting farmers from increasing. We can see here from the other categories, slight increases from 1997. When we look at it in graphical standpoint, by land acreage, again, it's astonishing to see here in 1920, 40 million. But now we're right around 5. So without having access to land, minority farm numbers are declining. What does that indicate about the economics of it? How are these producers faring? How are they making a living? I found this very interesting article by ERS, and they were looking at it from a snapshot in time, so from 2018 to 2020. But they were focusing on African American farmers and how they fared against all other producers. So I thought this was very interesting because when you look at acres operated, and these are all averages, and it's not NAS census data, is ARMS data, which is Agricultural Resource Management Survey. And so that's different than the Census of Agriculture data. So I want to make sure that I am clear about that. But the information is still quite astonishing because we see, the gross income for African American farmers as recently as the time period of 2018 to 2020, around 25,000, whereas all other groups aggregated is around 170,000. Net cash farm income is in the negative, whereas you have a positive for all other categories. So even looking at government payments, they're consistently behind other farm groups. the next chart that's on my right is the average African American farm produce commodities. They're around $150,000 less than other farms. And you can see the breakdown. You have crop production versus livestock production, but even on just looking at it relative to crop production, it's still lower. Livestock production is still lower. So what is contributing to this? In working with African American farmers and growing up on a farm myself, with my dad, my family, my father, my grandfathers, were all farmers, and having conversations around some of those barriers. A topic that consistently comes up is not having access to capital, meaning you don't have the liquidity or you don't have the ability to expand. Air property issues or land tenure issues is something that has been a hindrance to many producers, not just Black farmers or minority farmers, but many farmers have air property issues. But you see it to a greater extent in African American communities or farmers, which limits their ability to apply for certain government programs or maybe even industry programs. So that's a limiting factor. Either denial or receiving late payments from lending services has also contributed to that. Many African American farmers, as well as other farmers, I want to be fair and transparent, but they have off-farm jobs. And because they're operating with very thin margins and sometimes with losses, that has contributed to the number of farmers that are dwindling. Then you throw in climate change, increases in inputs that are also squeezing margins, and then the volatility in commodity markets or prices for uh, produce or prices for commodities, prices for livestock, the fluctuations, it makes it very, very difficult to make a living. And so when we're thinking about the work that needs to be done and how climate change has now become a major issue for not only US agriculture, but for global agriculture. And when we think about these minority farmers and some of the barriers that they're already facing, we really, really have to think hard about how we can help support them through this transition so that they are able to remain sustainable, become more economically feasible, and have access to these new markets. So climate change, that's something that we've all heard over and over again. It is a major issue in production agriculture, as I said, not just in the US, but also on a global scale. And I think the top three impacts on agriculture are the following. Changes in ag productivity, meaning yields and economic viability. What does that mean, for producers? And thinking about input costs and also impacts on soil quality and water resources. That's another major issue of climate change. And then health challenges to agricultural workers and livestock. Heat stress is real. Many agricultural workers are, they're outside, they're in the heat. So that does have a health impact. And then we can think in terms of what does that mean for the growing season, the start and the beginning. Places that if we divide the United States in half, we can say that the western part of the United States has been in a perpetual dry state. I learned at the World Board that it's a difference between dry conditions and drought. And so until NOAA declares a drought, I'll just say dry conditions. But they've been perpetually dry for most of my professional career of 20 years. So thinking about the production that takes place in states such as California, what does that mean and how does that translate over time if we're still thinking of ways to battle climate change? Is is there the opportunity for some of the crops that are grown on the western portion of the country to be moved other places? Also, thinking in terms of the South, temperatures in the South during the summer, planting, growing season, harvesting season has always been, warm, but they're hotter than usual, somewhere up between 10 degrees. And so as we're looking at the increase in temperatures, what effects does that have on crop productivity and what effect does that have on the growing season? Those all impact farmers' bottom lines, as well as thinking about what risk mitigation tools can be utilized to help and support farmers as they begin to think about how to transition to regenerative or climate smart practices. I I personally believe that all farmers, to a certain extent, are utilizing these practices. However, we have to be logical in our assessment that if you've been a conventional farmer, or if you've been utilizing a certain system to grow your crops all these years, the transition to something such as a climate smart or regenerative, it may cost you some upfront costs. And so that also is a barrier to that I see to transitioning because you may not have the margins to do that. And so that's also something else that, we can really dive into a little bit deeper. So, in my research or studying or trying to learn more about, this nexus that we're at with climate smart agriculture and regenerative agriculture, I always try to find a definition. And when I went to try to find a definition, there were so many definitions and they were so different from each other. I think one of the major starting points is that we need to have a clear and concise definition of what climate smart agriculture is and what regenerative agriculture means. So for me, I just tried my best to have a clear, concise definition and some of the main goals of the two. And so I always like to go back to the genesis of stuff. So, climate smart agriculture was first defined in 2010. And some of the main goals is increased productivity, enhanced resilience, and reduced emissions. So that's climate smart. When we talk about regenerative, they're two different things. And I do believe in this space, sometimes they're used interchangeably, and that's not always correct. So regenerative agriculture refers to holistic set of farming practices. They're focusing on soil health, carbon sequestration, water management and optimization, integrated pest management, and to some extent, animal integration. I look at it as climate smart commodity being a huge umbrella and regenerative agriculture falls um, under that umbrella, so to speak. Or if you think about it in terms of concentric circles, there is overlap between the two, but there are some differences in climate smart and regenerative agriculture. However, over the last 10 years or so, there's been more momentum and regenerative agriculture and climate smart have become somewhat of very sexy topics. But for a lot of minority producers, they've already been utilizing these practices to a certain extent. Some of them in their day-to-day operations, specifically for minority farmers who never really transitioned to conventional or row crop production, they were utilizing these. However, again, to fully integrate into their production systems, the barrier has always been the access to capital to fully invest in the infrastructure needed to go full steams ahead, for a lack of better terminology. So when we're thinking about regenerative and climate smart commodities, I know for many of us, when you hear the term climate smart, we think about USDA's partnerships for climate smart commodities. And I am very interested to see the outcome of the programs at the end of the 5-year term, and just how much information, technical assistance was provided to producers, how many producers adopted it, what the rate of adoption was, because I feel that that's going to be a very important gauge as we continue to talk about this transition. And then also just the outlines of the environmental benefits, the economic benefits, the social benefits. Now, climate smart commodity partnerships for climate smart commodities is just the beginning, because this is a program, it has a term of 5 years, but we should be thinking now as industry stakeholders about how we are going to continue this, or a continuation of providing access to these producers, providing information, so that we don't see a drop off because the program has ended. So I'm very interested to hear folks' ideas around what are some mechanisms that we can start looking at now, or contingency plans to make sure that we are preparing to continue the work even after the climate smart commodity terms are finished. But I created 3 buckets that I think are very important to climate smart and regenerative agriculture. The first bucket being environmental benefits. That is always touted as the most important. When you read about it, we go to conferences and we hear words thrown around like carbon sequestration and better soil, improved soil health. And that is so important because soil is the basis, for crop production or food production. And so I think that that's a very critical point that needs to have more attention, and what that means for minority producers, because they typically tend to operate on smaller farms, but because they may have less productive farms, you may have more than one soil type on, your acreage. So being able to test the soil and think through the different strategies and the benefits so that you can have better soil quality over time and increase production yields, I believe is going to be very important. Also, water conservation and optimization. That is also crucial and important to making sure that crops are grown and that we are seeing strong yields. And then the flip side of that, when you're thinking about conventional production, is reduced reliance on chemical inputs or synthetic fertilizers, things of that nature, and climate change resiliency. This transition is in fact about climate change resiliency, because minority producers are already disproportionately impacted more negatively than other producers. It's even more important that when we're thinking about climate smart and regenerative agriculture, that we keep in mind these producers and their limited access and their limited resources, and thinking of ways to be intentional and targeting these producers so that they can benefit and have the same access. What we don't want to see or come to fruition with climate smart and regenerative agriculture practices is having another agricultural system that is inequitable. Again, these producers should be at the forefront. They should be those producers that are early adopting and that are benefiting from all of the great outcomes and the impacts of what these practices can do. On the economic side, increased yields. You'll see I have an asterisk there as well as an asterisk beside input cost reductions. Because number one is in the beginning, you may see a decrease in yield as you're transitioning. You may see the same thing with your costs, your input costs. You may see higher upfront costs to get you started and transitioned. And that is something that to me is where a lot of producers need the most help, because you have farmers that want to adopt, but they are economically strained. So having upfront support financially or some type of incentive financial program to help in the beginning of the transition. I'm not talking about long-term overtime. I'm talking about at the beginning, there needs to be mechanisms to support these producers financially so that they can, it helps to soften the blow of the initial decreasing yields or the initial rise in input costs. But over time, as you're continuing to implement them, those should subside. But we need upfront help and support. Also, premium market access. Now, consumers as well as CPGs and agribusiness industry stakeholders, we're seeing a growing trend of folks wanting food grown more sustainably, wanting to know how things are grown, and that's great. But when I think about where we are with climate smart and regenerative agriculture, I think it's very important that there will be, or there should be, premiums in place to help support that for farmers that are able to adopt those practices and implement those practices, whether that's some type of certification or whether that means that they're, some way to make sure that it is known how the food is produced and that these farmers have access to that they are intentionally sought out so that they can have access to premium markets to help them over time. That will provide increase to farmer livelihoods. Farmers typically in communities, that money goes back into community and it has an indirect effect. So more like an economic effect to a community as a whole. So we really need to think about how we can make sure that minority farmers have access to these premium markets. Another stream of income could potentially be carbon credit programs, government support programs such as climate smart commodities, but there are also other programs within USDA that provide support to conservation and regenerative agricultural practices, and also within the industry, knowing what those programs are, what agribusiness company is providing incentives or programs for farmers who want to transition, and making sure that that information is provided to minority farmers, because sometimes it boils down to they just don't know. And so that's what I mean about being intentional and targeting these producers with arming them with information and letting them know what's available to them and providing them support into accessing these markets. And then long-term land values, over time, utilizing these practices, increases soil health and has a long-term expected increase in land values. So I have not heard many people talking about the social benefits of climate smart and regenerative agriculture. And I always like to think about things in terms of, what is the social aspect of it? How does this help the producer beyond just the economics and the environmental? But thinking in terms of community resilience, a lot of these farmers are small scale farmers, and it's about community and serving the community. And so the level of community resilience, we could see that increase because there'll be exchanging of ideas and knowledge and techniques, as well as increased food security, improved farmer livelihood. That kind of ties back in with the economic benefits of it. Over time, the expectation is that farmers will see economic returns as a result of implementing and transitioning to these climate smart regenerative agricultural practices through open access to premium markets. And then the social equity of it. Again, we don't want to see another agricultural subsystem that only caters to larger or medium scale farmers, non-minority farmers, but we want to make sure that we're very inclusive and that it's intentional, that equity is woven into the adoption and how we engage and how we do outreach with these particular communities. Cultural preservation is something that I have not heard many folks talk about because, again, a lot of these farmers and producers have been utilizing these techniques to a certain extent. This is not something that is new, that someone made up and it's just this new innovative technology. No, these are practices that folks have been able to utilize for many, many, many years, centuries even. However, to be denied access to markets and to not be able to fully transition because you don't have the finances for the infrastructure has definitely proven to be a barrier. And it's important that we, those of us on this call, and when I say we, I mean NGOs, land grant institutions, researchers, agribusiness stakeholders, the government, private sector, and legislators all come together and think of unique and innovative ways to help preserve our minority producers, but also realizing that they need our support in transitioning to these particular practices. And that goes along with education and engagement. There's going to be some education that needs to take place. Materials need to be developed. And I think that's a great way for economists and researchers to work together and to collaborate and to really think about some cool ways that we can educate and engage these audiences and explaining to them like what the transition could actually look like for them in the beginning, in the middle, and long term, providing them with economic data on, hey, this is what you could see if you continue to utilize this practice. Not only does it have economic benefits, but it has environmental benefits and social benefits as well. So throughout the presentation, I've kind of been weaving or throwing little tidbits out there about some of the barriers that minority farmers are facing. And this list is in no way exhaustive, but these are just some of the underlying barriers that we at Freedmen Heirs are hearing over and over again. And number one is limited access to capital. For minority farmers, and this has absolutely nothing to do with climate smart and regenerative. They just have limited access to capital. So when you throw on top of them another layer of transitioning to climate smart or regenerative, that's even more of a burden. And so making sure that we are thinking about access to capital in more innovative ways, and what does that mean for having access to capital generally, but access to capital as they transition. Many farmers are operating with very thin margins or negative margins. And so it's not that they don't have a desire to fully transition, it's just that it's not economically feasible for them right now. We talked about land tenure issues and heir property. That's another significant barrier. And maybe thinking in terms of what type of initiatives that can be implemented to help producers clear up land tenure issues, while also providing them the opportunity to begin the transition. So simultaneously working at two times. We're working on the land tenure issues, but we're also working on transitioning. So doing things the way that we've always done them is not going to get us anywhere. Specifically, when it comes to working with minority producers, we have to think innovatively, and we have to be very intentional about how we are looking at supporting them. Discriminatory practices and biases, that's still prevalent for many farmers. I've heard several stories even this year about discriminatory practices and biases, and that leads to continued levels of distrust. And so that distrust also goes hand in hand with being risk averse or not wanting to take the risk on transitioning or trying a different agricultural practices, and that ties into upfront infrastructure and technology costs. There are costs that are associated with these transitions, and so it may seem simplistic to say, oh, producers need to transition and we need to get producers to transition, but those costs that we're not thinking about for a lot of these smallholder farmers. One thing when it comes to technology, a lot of places that are rural in rural America, they don't have broadband. The infrastructure that they need, irrigation and things like that. Those are some of the needs. And then also making sure that they are understanding and know what programs are available to help them within USDA to circumvent some of the infrastructure issues that they may be having. Limited market access and price premiums. This goes without saying. Many minority farmers have said it over and over again. It does not matter which group you speak with. Limited market access has always been a major barrier. Being left out of markets is a surefire way for any farmer to operate within margins. You need markets. No farmer puts seeds in the ground and not thinking about what market they're going to sell it to. That's not how farmers think. And so making sure that there is equitable access to these markets and that prices are equitable, because we don't want, again, to have a price system set up where farmers are not receiving their due for the work that they're putting in for this transition. Also, social and cultural barriers. I've always a mindset. Think of it in terms of mindset. I've always done it this way. I don't see anything wrong with it. I'm not sure I'm buying into climate change. Those are all barriers as well, and just helping the farmer to understand. And I think that's where that engagement, building the relationship, building the rapport, the education comes into play. Working all three of them simultaneously will help producers understand. Knowledge is very powerful. When you understand something, when you understand what climate smart is, when you understand regenerative agricultural practices and what you're getting into, you're able to make a confident decision on what it is that you want to do. And that helps producers, feel respected and understood, but it also allows them to make an informed decision. Knowledge and education gaps. I think that this is a very, very, very good opportunity for collaborations with public-private partnerships, with land grant institutions, minority serving institutions, the government, NGOs, scientists, researchers, to really come up with some innovative and cool ways to address the knowledge and education gaps, and then thinking about how that can be translated to producers and terminology that they understand. And I do believe that even working with the younger generation of farmers that's coming up now to help them to be mentors or teachers to the older generation, and there can be an exchange of knowledge. because the older generation has generational knowledge. They know about farming. They've seen several cycles of planting seasons, harvesting seasons. So there is a knowledge exchange that can take place. And I think that we really have to take advantage of that while we have that opportunity. So when I was looking at some of the barriers, it caused me to also think about, well, how do we combat those barriers? So looking at each of these as a pain point, I started to think about strategies for investment and support, which is where we all come in. So when we're thinking about limited access to capital, what are some financial incentives that can be utilized? Are subsidies on the table, different types of grants from both the government and the private sector to support farmers? Are there alternative financing mechanisms that can be utilized to help transition this investment, meaning from philanthropy? There is more interest from the philanthropy world regarding climate change and how it impacts farmers, how it impacts um, just the nation as a whole. So I think that if we can pull all these pieces together, that those strategies will unfold to help transition this investment. Also, innovative financing, low interest loans or no interest loans. Everything should be on the table and talked about in a way that we're able to design things that will be truly supportive to the producers, but also it will support over the long term and allow these producers to be sustainable. For many farmers, they don't want to go to USDA and get a loan, or they don't want to go through an ag lending service to get a loan because they have been discriminated against in the past, or they just had a bad experience. So we really need to think about how we can meet these farmers where they are, but also provide them with the help that they need. Tailored technical assistance. And this is where I like to use this terminology, cultural competence comes in at. For each ethnic group or minority group, there are some things that are innate to that specific culture. And so when we're thinking about technical assistance, we also need to make sure that we understand what those cultural norms are, so that when we are working with the groups and we're thinking through these programs and these investments, that number one, we're not offensive and disrespectful, and number two, that we are actually meeting them where they are and providing the need that they have. I think technical assistance is so important because it allows us the opportunity to build relationship and actually hear the farmer. I've heard so many times, well, Seneca, all these programs that come out, but nobody ever talks to us about them. We don't want to get into the habit of designing things that we think farmers need, as opposed to listening to what they need and building a consensus or an ecosystem around them. Land access initiatives, that ties back to land tenure issues. How can we think about being creative? What workshops can we utilize to help farmers to understand air property issues? Are there ways that we can engage state bar associations to help with pro bono work? Like, are there other alternatives that we can use in conjunction with some of the projects and organizations that are already doing the work, but we want to amplify it? And we want to make sure that it is far reaching. But not only that, once land tenure issues are cleared, helping folks to understand the importance of having a will, of having a succession plan, of having an estate plan, that all goes into that education piece so that the next generation doesn't have to fight their way through land tenure issues as well. market access and initiatives and development. Now, this is where I think government and ag industry stakeholders will play a key role. Having access to markets, making sure that markets are equitable, and also helping farmers or doing a better job at outreach and engagement so that farmers know about these programs. USDA is typically what farmers think about when they think about programs. But some agribusiness companies or organizations also have market access programs, but many farmers don't know about it. And so making sure that this information is widely available and disseminated, but also that anchors back on that tailored technical assistance and making sure that it's not just a diversity box that's going to be checked, but it's something that is important to the organization and innate into the DNA of the organization that, hey, we have specific goals around diversity and equity that we want to make sure is integrated into our programs. And we are outlining strategies to make sure that these initiatives are engaged with NGOs that service minority producers or land grant institutions that work closely with them, just getting the information out and being available to the producer for questions and what this could actually mean for them in terms of market access. Research and collaboration, this encompasses everything that I'm talking about. The research component of it is going to be crucial going forward, specifically on the science side. We all, I talked a little bit about the yields and productivity and things of that nature. Those are all very important constructs that need to continue to have research behind them so that we can think of ways that we can combat them, come together in a collaborative nature, and make sure that we're providing the support that's needed. Now, I want to spend some time on the risk management aspect of it, because I think that risk management is going to be very important in transitioning to climate smart and regen ag, just because of my brain is going faster than I'm able to keep up with it. But the layer of throwing in the layer of climate change and climate instability and instability and weather patterns, that increases a farmer's risk level, all farmers. Farming is a risky business. And so making sure that minority producers have access to risk management tools. Many of them don't have access to it. And so this is something that needs to really be on the radar of how can we teach farmers to manage their risk and providing tools for them to manage their risk. That's going to help them be successful. We really have to do the work to help farmers understand risk management tools and how to utilize them properly and it doesn't matter how small your farm is, what you grow, there needs to be a risk management plan in place, because we have no control of the weather. We have no control of, over differing weather patterns to a certain extent. We don't have that control. And so we definitely want to have clear-cut strategies and even to a certain extent guidelines that we can work with producers to set up these plans as another layer of protection. Intentional community engagement goes hand in hand with tailored technical assistance and capacity building and training programs. When you are transitioning to something new that's different than what you've always done before, there needs to be capacity building and training programs that are implemented to support these producers. And so we need to think about how, again, this collaboration, public-private partnerships, Can we do, and even now, you know, thinking in terms of social media and the internet, how you can have courses that are available, folks can take on their own time, informational YouTube videos, or I think now US Ag has a very strong following on TikTok, and you know, just making sure that the information is disseminated and allow folks to digest it in the way that's most palatable for them. And I say that because we have a growing and emerging group of new and beginning and young farmers that are coming along, and that's what they're looking at. They're on social media, they're on the internet. Oh, sorry. They're on their phones. So having utilizing those outlets to reach them is going to be imperative going forward. I don't see smartphones going anywhere, the internet or social media. So not using it is to the detriment of the community as opposed to embracing it in a way that we can meet different groups where they are. So thank you for your time. I really enjoyed speaking and talking with everyone about this. I am looking forward to engaging and hearing your thoughts and your comments and your questions.
So, Seneca, I've been monitoring the chat, so I'll facilitate some questions for you if you don't mind.
Yes, that'll
So,
be
one of the
stop
first,
sharing. I
well,
think
first of all,
sharing.
thank you for an amazing presentation. It was awesome, and it generated a lot of thought in the chat. So the first question that we have from Kisa is, what are some concrete values and actions that establish the equitable partnership that you were talking about, especially around like how do we ensure these partnerships? You mentioned partnership and accountability, which I think is a really new concept for a lot of folks, being equitable and accountable in these partnerships and not being kind of more patriarchal, which I think is like we're coming from on high to tell you all the things that you
Mhm.
working in these communities, that does not, well, that doesn't, I think,
It's a
align
good
well with
turnoff.
most of our producers, but it definitely, speaks to that cultural competence. So the first question is around like, what do you think some concrete values and actions could be taken to establish these equitable partnerships?
That's a great question. And I think starting off is let the farmers lead. As you mentioned, Dr. Odom, don't go in with the savior complex. Like, I'm here to tell you about this new technique that you need to adopt. No, let the farmer lead. Transparency, honesty is key with producers, specifically producers that are limited resource. They just want the truth, whether it's good or bad. It's always great to be honest. So don't go into it thinking, oh, I'm going to sell them this and they should take it because, hey, this is great. Also, going in with the attitude of being humble and learning, because I guarantee you, talking to, and not just Black farmers, but any minority group of farmers, you're going to learn about some things that you never thought about. You're going to hear about some of the barriers, the challenges, the difficulties that they face, that's going to cause you to rethink how you engage and how you do things, but also being willing to engage and get outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
It's so important for us to be authentic when
Mhm.
we're talking to these producers, but also you may need to talk to or go into a community of folks that don't look like you,
Yes.
and being willing to do that, but also as you go, learning or being culturally competent, learning what those norms are, so that there can be authentic relationship building. Don't go into it thinking as a transaction.
And I think one of the things you brought up that resonated with me is not walking in assuming your norms are the norms, right? I think it's very common if you come from a majority culture to think that the way that you move is the way that everyone should move. And so you come into different engaged communities that have a different pacing, they have a different order in which they do things, or even something as simple as the importance of fellowship with food, right? That doesn't seem like a big deal, but in some communities, that is really key. And if you don't do those components, if you miss that, you don't connect the way that you think you will. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. For anyone, if I butcher your name, charge my head, not my heart. So I'm going to say this is Jerry or Gary had a question around, are there some good examples of cooperative ventures or things that reduce the cost for certification that you are aware of?
That is a good question. I'm thinking, do you mean cost for certifications of climate smart and regenerative agriculture?
So I believe the comment came when you were going over that part of your conversation, but if we captured it wrong, put it in the chat, folks, and we'll monitor to make sure we're answering your question appropriately.
Well, I think a good place to start is, the climate partnerships for climate smart commodity is, in a way, those partnerships are providing payments, incentives, technical assistance, access to technology. All of these things are coming at subsidized or little to no cost to producers to engage in. And I think that, farmers of color specifically should look into what programs best suit their needs,
Mhm.
and what organizations align with, what they have going on their particular organization or what commodity that they're working with. But I think that's a great start because otherwise, having access to, this drones and soil testing and all of it, that's very, very expensive. Now there could be other NGOs that provide support, through financial assistance. We at Freedmen Heirs, we are one NGO or nonprofit organization that works to provide, technical assistance and access to capital. But there are many others out there as well. Also thinking about the relationship with NGOs and land grant institutions. Many land grant institutions and researchers have grant finances that will allow them to support producers to a certain extent. Now, it may not be to the same level as you'll see coming out of the federal government, but when you're thinking in terms of community or closer to farmers and communities, that's one place I would start.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. So I'll ask another question. As you listed cultural preservation as kind of one of the key components. I very often will hear other, one of the things I appreciated about your analysis of regenerative agriculture is you're absolutely right. There are 1,000 definitions. And they're similar, but they're not the same. But I think the thing that I appreciated about your analysis was I resonate with the definitions of regenerative agriculture that center the human aspect as well, because it's thinking about the holistic system, but also thinking about the human aspect. So I think that's why I was so struck by your inclusion of cultural preservation. So I'd love to get, but in your mind, like, how did you determine that that would be so key to meaningful engagement with minority producers? Not just cultural competence, but cultural preservation. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about why you put these things so high up on your list of things we need to engage with.
So when I was thinking about cultural preservations, I was specifically thinking about Black farmers because the outlook is dismal. I mean, to go from 1 million to 41,000, based on NASS Census of Agriculture data, the decline was so drastic and so fast. What happened to all that knowledge?
Mhm.
And the knowledge base that we have now, because you have an aging farmer population, who are they passing that knowledge on to? And that can be applied to all minority farmers. Who are they passing the knowledge on to? How is that knowledge being, documented?
Yes.
And so not not losing the culture of production agriculture is something that I view as very important, especially from a social aspect. And so, when you're thinking in terms of different cultures, and indigenous people and Native Americans, they have a distinct culture. Black farmers have a distinct culture that is integrated with some African culture because of bringing enslaved folks here to the United States, and so we don't want to lose that. So I think about crops such as rice and cotton. Well, those are crops that are indigenous to Africa. They weren't here when folks settled, and so what does that mean as far as communities that are still growing like heirloom seeds and other heirloom specialty crops as time goes on, and most Americans are not familiar with them? What's going to happen to that knowledge? And we want to try to hold on to that and think of ways that we can preserve those cultural aspects in agriculture.
And I think especially as we think about these regenerative systems, what are we always talking about? What are new crops we can introduce? What are new crops that we could have access to that might benefit our diets, right? Those crops might be growing right now, but they're not widely understood or accessible. And I do find that they tend to be grown on smaller farms, on more integrated farms. And then as your report shows, those farmers tend to be minority farmers, right? And so I think there's a wealth of just opportunity that's not being explored as it comes to looking at different cultivars, different varietals, different seeds, there are so many varieties of collard green, right? Let's
Yes.
look at that. Okra, let's look at that. The other part that struck
Tomatoes.
Right, tomatoes. And the other thing that struck me that really kind of moved me is there's so much emphasis on this interest in traditional ecological knowledge. But I think when people think about that, they don't think about, like, we don't just mean one type of farmer. When you have a vision, I think, in your mind when we say that, but it's a wide range of producers
Mhm.
that have been here for hundreds of years, and they've lent their own historical context to it. And so how do we preserve all of that traditional ecological knowledge? And also, how do we identify growers? Because I think sometimes we get very much like researchers are the ones that are determined, but how do we shift the idea to remember that farm workers are holders of traditional ecological knowledge?
Exactly.
And how do we make sure that we don't lose that rich resource? So my next question that I got in the chat was,
Can we backtrack to
yes,
one
of
question? I
course, I'll
think
do it.
Jerry put something in
Oh yeah,
the
to make
chat.
sure we covered
And
it.
Jerry, if you could check out the Organic Trade Association.
Mhm.
I think you were specifically talking about certified organic. And they have a great team there that'll be able to help you and walk you through that process, and provide you with some of the resources they may have to help with the cost of transitioning or becoming certified organic. Hope that helps.
Thank you for that. So
Mhm.
then the next question for you is, could you provide guidance on how farmers and community groups could evaluate opportunities to partner with climate or regenerative ag groups to ensure the partnership is fair, healthy, and sustainable? So basically, what's some guidance you would give to farmers and community groups as they're thinking about whether or not to engage with some of these partners, right? Now that equity and climate are a thing, a lot of opportunities are coming fast and loose. But how do you know what is a valid opportunity or fair and equitable opportunity?
Right. Number one, I would say, vetting who it is that you want to work with. Making sure that I'm very big on, value alignment. You can engage and collaborate, but it still needs to be value aligned in what it is that you're producing or a particular community is producing. And then making sure that there's a understanding between all parties involved. That goes back to being transformational with your partnerships as opposed to being transactional. If you feel that it's a transactional relationship and they only want to get your data, then that's an indication that you probably, may not want to move forward in the conversation. Also, what are the accountability metrics? If you are engaged in a partnership, there should be continuous communication. What are the feedback channels? You should have access to all the information and knowledge, also the ability to answer questions, and to get responses that make sense. And also the respect for the community. You want to have a partner that wants to engage in the community, that wants to, come together and support and see the work that's being done, as opposed to partnering with someone and there's no engagement there. And it all goes back to thinking in terms of what is the outcome that you want to see for your community and the farmers in your community. How do you want to engage going forward? For me, I always think in terms of it's great to start off in alignment, but then what is the contingency after that? We want to continue to do this work. We don't want to start projects, get producers excited, and then after 3 years, oh, we don't have funding for that, or that's not something that's of interest to us anymore. So thinking about folks that diversity and equity is important to them, and the ways that they're thinking about how are we going to continue to do this work going forward, and that you're not being taken advantage of, and that you're not being utilized just, to check a diversity box for a government program or any other program that they may be working on. Oh no. Am I frozen? I'm not sure what happened.
Seneca, you're fine. I think Lakeisha froze for a minute.
Oh, okay.
Right. First of all, the conversation was good. They had to kick me out, but I'm back. Um, so I definitely caught the last of that. So one thing I need to ask is, will Freedman Ayers put out a shirt that says transformational, not transactional, and can I buy one? Can we have
Absolutely.
that? I need that for myself. Like that I wrote and highlighted and underlined. Like it's
Absolutely.
and then to go back into the lab, I think we had a few more questions in the chat. Unfortunately, the chat, oh, there we go. I was like, I lost my chat, but it's back. So then the second question was, do you have additional advice for policymakers on how to be supportive to minority producers in the climate transition? There are outreach mechanisms or research or resources that need to be developed. So I also am extremely interested in the research components that need to be developed.
Yes, I think that there's a direct linkage. And so I tend to think about things visually. So I'm going to try to describe this to everybody. Policymakers, researchers, NGOs, minority producers, and government in there as well. But I think the importance of is working with researchers to understand what policy changes need to be changed or what needs to be taking place, but then also working and building relationships with NGOs and other community-based organizations that support minority producers, so that there's a clear understanding of what the need is. That goes back to, I've heard it said so many times, programs and policies are being made without our input.
Yes.
So
Right.
making sure that those mechanisms are not just, oh, we're going to talk amongst ourselves or only a few groups, but having diversity in the outreach and the folks that you're talking to, so that you can get a clear picture, because one size doesn't fit all. And so there are needs based off of, the different types of farmers and producers. And so for policymakers, I think it's very important for them to be sensitive to that and to have a clear understanding of the different types of farmers. And that will provide you some insights when you're thinking through policy and how that affects it. But then I think it's important, that relationship with researchers and economists, because you need data and you need understanding to help you to formulate policy that actually works. And so
Mhm.
connecting with minority researchers in agriculture and minority ag economists and minority folks that represent these groups is going to give you a different perspective than what you would normally get.
And I think researchers and economists that are embedded within these communities as well, right? There's a particular way that you understand something if you are of that community, right? That's one. The other thing I would say, not speaking to policymakers because a foundation like mine, we fund research, but I do challenge myself to say that even in the ways in which we design our research opportunities, we could take more into account identity, right? So we create these really complicated RFAs, and you have to provide all this information. The reporting can sometimes, those things alone can be a barrier. So you're creating a funding mechanism and you hope that you will provide access, but the funding mechanism is such that it is another barrier. So I think the other part is, outside of those of us that we don't create policy, I think there's a lot of other opportunity that those folks in the public and private sector that aren't federal entities, we can do some things as well. How you write your contracts, the type of reporting you require, the type of technical assistance you provide in completing those documents. There's a lot that can be done in that space that I don't think we're taking advantage of to have the impact in these underserved populations to counter some of the systemic issues that just exist and have been designed intentionally, right? Let's call it what it is. Historically, these barriers were by design. Now, I think sometimes we keep trying to build onto
Right.
build a
Yeah.
new thing on a bad system. And then we wonder why it doesn't work. Because in some ways we have to dismantle that system because the system inherently was designed to be exclusionary, right? So even if we're trying to do a new thing on top of it, we're starting with a base that never was designed to do what you want it to do. So that then I think, I don't know what you think, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I think that does also create an additional barrier that we don't always intend, right?
I agree with you 100%, but I really want to dial in on the point that you made about these hindrances, such as
Mhm.
reporting.
Mhm.
Many minority producers don't have the capacity, nor do the minority organizations that support these producers have the capacity for all this extra reporting. Streamlining processes, thinking of alternative ways to get feedback and inputs from the producers, I think is very, very important. And then also let's talk about the data piece of it and how being transparent around data usage and collection of data and what it's used for, all of these different components, because that's also in a way becoming a barrier because now people, their senses go up every time you ask for a piece of information. Why do you need this? Why do you need that? So thinking about ways that streamlining that process, because if you do this program, let's say with Freedmen Heirs, I might have to give them this. But if I work with FAR or a group that's working with FAR, I might have to give them this. It's that constant pull till they get to the point of, I don't want to do it.
Yeah,
And
that's
so we're creating barriers as we go because, again, the system was set up to be tedious and to weed folks out. It's like, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to answer all these questions. I'm not going to do it. And we don't want that to happen.
and I think it was someone that said in the chat also, there's a lot of trauma around, like
Oh,
folks whose
absolutely.
families have been in agriculture, minorities whose families have been in agriculture for just one generation. There's also a lot of trauma sometimes in engaging. And so you wonder why there's so much reluctance or resistance. It's because real harm has been done historically. And even if you're coming with good intentions, you have to be aware of that hurt, or else you're just not going to achieve those desired results. So one thing I just want to say to the folks in the chat, I'm loving the community. People are asking for stuff and getting responses in the chat. So if
Wonderful.
anyone is
Wonderful.
not looking in the chat, there's a lot of great resources being shared in there. And so thanks to everyone that's sharing and creating that learning opportunity even within the chat.
Yay.
Right. It's
Great.
I love it. And so then the next question is around, it's probably two questions from Daniel around financial options available to support transition to regenerative agriculture. And then he also had a question around what equipment and infrastructure upgrades do you think might be necessary for regenerative agriculture?
That is a good question. I'll start with the infrastructure. You know, for a lot of folks that thinking in terms of soil health and management, you know, getting your soil tested so that you know where you're at. And then thinking through a plan or working with a soil scientist on a plan to help you increase your soil health. Or, I'm not a soil scientist, everyone. I am an ag economist by training, but Dr. Odom is a soil scientist. But, you know, thinking about that, I look at that as part of infrastructure. Also, water optimization and water management is going to be very integral, especially for our farmer friends that are in the western half of the United States. I know USDA's, NRCS EQIP program, they do a lot around supporting producers with on-farm infrastructure support. So if you're thinking about that, you may want to check them out. I would also think about, sometimes people don't think about this, but, planting trees if you want to do any type of silvoplaster. And, there are so many different techniques that are available that can count, or I count them as infrastructure, because it's things that are needed on farm in order for you to fully adopt this new technique, being it climate smart or regenerative. So that's the last half of your question. I'm sorry, Dr. Odom, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing that you had mentioned was around technical assistance and culturally appropriate technical assistance, because that's a key part too, right? Like a lot of times you can read the website, it can tell you what to do, you can read the book, but then you still may need support. And I would say that I find that a lot of our land grant universities are amazing resources to help you understand if you want to try a new technique. They're often doing research and piloting things, or are willing to work with you to pilot some things. So even if the resource or the need doesn't exist yet, that doesn't mean that there might not be somebody interested in engaging. So I would also think for folks that might be interested in transitioning and not quite know where to start, check and see if you have a land grant university in your area. That's a great place to start. And those researchers and those students and those PhD candidates and those farm folks are there to help you, and they often will have extension. And that's a space where you can also look for resources and guidance as far as how you could get started. But Seneca is absolutely correct. The first place is just to get a sense of where you are, a baseline, right? If you don't know your soil type, there are lots of resources that can help you figure that out. If you don't know, a lot of things about like what you need on in your particular production system, or what regenerative practices you want to adopt, you don't have to adopt all of them. You could try one,
Right,
right? You could just
right.
try one and see how that feels, and then try another and another. Because as Seneca indicated, we recognize that this is a cost. There is a ROI on it, but it has a longer time horizon sometimes. Right. And so first is to get to understand what you need and maybe what you want to accomplish. And a lot of there are groups that can help you figure out how you want to plan for that. So I would say that also another great resource are your land grants, your extension agents in your area, local universities. And if all else fails, email us and we'll direct you towards somebody. Um,
And I
and
also think
yeah,
that's the importance of what we're doing now.
absolutely.
The importance of the work of these convenings is so that we can bring together folks across a spectrum, a plethora of minds to think about ways, as I mentioned with some of those strategies, everything should be on the table. Let's talk about what some financial options could look like. What are some financial packages that don't exist right now, but because we know there is a need for them, we can come together in public-private partnerships and develop it and disseminate those finances to support the transition. So your question has me thinking about, okay, how can we do this?
Yep.
What are some, financial investments can we package
Mhm.
to get the job done? And so,
Absolutely.
as you mentioned, Dr. Odom, just because it's not available now doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be available. But the purpose of this convening is to pull together these ideas and
Mhm.
think about them and then synthesize them and, present them as recommendations or thinking about what type of recommendations that we can present as a result of this.
Absolutely. I think the thing that I'm most struck by this conversation and subsequent previous conversations that you and I have had is like, in order to create something new, you have to create something new, right? And I think that we sometimes get very comfortable relying on existing systems and trying to recreate that wheel and make the wheel a little bit nicer, make the wheel blue instead of green. Maybe you don't need a wheel, maybe you need a triangle, maybe you need a polygon, maybe you need something else. Right. And so I think so much of what you said around working with farmers to actually solve the problem that they have and not the problem we think they have would go a long way also. I think sometimes, we've and I say we collective as a researcher or those that are in scientist positions, or we think we know what someone else needs, right? And that's a very human thing to do. Somebody else sees you and they go, "Oh, I know what your problem is," but you never actually asked me what my problem really was. And if you were to ask me, it'd probably be very different than what you thought. And so then how can we do a better job of designing with the end user that would resolve their challenges, right? And that's another way we could think about it. The second part of that question was financial options available to support transition.
To Daniel's question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yeah, I think, thinking in terms of what financial options are available right now specifically to support that transition, I would again go back to, there are some climate smart commodity programs that are, Partnership for Climate Smart Commodity, with different organizations that are providing some support for adopting different types of regenerative agricultural programs. Also, there are some agribusinesses, depending upon what you grow. I'm assuming that you're a farmer, Mr. Daniel, but I'm not for sure. There are some agribusinesses that may have programs that provide some sort of financial assistance to help with the transition. So I would say the first step would definitely be, looking at USDA's Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. Are there any organizations that are in your area that support the work that you're doing? And reach out to them and say and ask them like, hey, I see that you are working on this type of grant or commodity. Also, as Dr. Odom said, universities, institutions of higher learning, extension, they also have grant dollars to provide support to producers. So I would say the first step is just reaching out. If you want to, feel free to shoot me an email and, we can kind of walk through what that process looks like, and I can help connect you with some people that I think may be able to support you.
Thank you so much for that, Seneca. I believe that that is the all of our questions. So I'd like to transition to the next slide to recognize that we will have another series of conversations coming up. So in August, we'll be talking about more about the state of the science. So Seneca hinted upon it today, the need for research and economists to do more work together. So I think that there's some space that we'll share around the current state of the science as it relates to things like adoption of soil health practices, needs and additional needs in economics research, and opportunities and barriers to increased adoption as we think about transitioning to more climate smart or regenerative practices. In October, we will have a conversation around mapping information networks and again, continuing to think about those barriers to accessing resource and funding. We had a lot of great questions questions like those from Daniel and Kisa about resources. And then in December, we'll have a more economics based discussion around benefit cost analysis and the real cost or ROI for minorities to transition to these practices. So with the follow-up email that each of the registrants will receive, they'll receive a recording, and we'll also include a registration link for these other webinar series. If you have not registered yet, there's plenty of time and you'll get lots of reminders. But we just want to thank you so much for sharing some time with us today. Go ahead, Seneca, give your thanks, and then this is our
Thank you, everyone.
presentation. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Odom. Thank you, Suzanne. And again, please feel free to email us if you have any questions. And I do believe my presentation will be attached to the outgoing webinar email. So everyone have a great Friday. Thank y'all for hanging in there with us. We really
Bye,
appreciate
Dr.
it.
Barco.
And we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar.
Bye, y'all. And please reach out if you have any questions. But
Please do.
we'll see you at the
Please do.
next one.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all. Have a wonderful weekend.